Okay, this video is going to be called When and Where Did Science Start? And what this comes out of is there's a lot of debate nowadays about what's good science and what's bad science. And I'm going to tell you that I think most modern science is bad, okay? And there's still lots of good science, but how does one find it and how does one become smarter about this whole situation? So knowing the history of the modern crisis in science helps you to be more intelligent about what information is reliable or not, and that can help you with your health and your understanding of a lot of other things. Okay, most of the information for this topic today comes from this book, For the Glory of God by Rodney Stark. He's a sociologist. He also wrote Victory of Reason, and he's a pretty good historian. We're going to go to, it's going to come from tons of other sources too, but this is sort of the key book. I abbreviated it FGG so I can show page numbers. If anybody else wants to read about it on their own, you'll be able to find the page numbers very quick. Okay, so science as we know it today, and by that it's meant where there's a hypothesis followed by experiments, followed by analysis of the results, and a subsequent development of a new theory or refinements of theory. Okay, what we consider modern science arose in medieval Christian Europe, and that's an important point because there's a lot of persons and corporations nowadays saying religion should have nothing to do with science. But the problem with getting rid of all religion in regard to science means it tends to lead to then there's no ethics. And when there's no ethics, the only goal is profit. And when the only goal is profit, then the consumer tends to be abused. So we'll talk a little bit about how this whole thing started. Edward Gibbon, he was an English Protestant. He wrote a book called The Fall of the Roman Empire, and he sort of was a major criticism of Catholicism, saying, basically when the Romans became Catholic, they turned into a bunch of pussies and they couldn't defend Rome anymore, and the barbarians kicked their ass, and then we got led into the dark ages of religious mysticism and superstition, and it was all primitive and backward and stupid until finally the smart English Protestants came along, and then there was the great development of science, and there was also the Enlightenment, okay, and that idea of trying to say the Middle Ages Catholics were a bunch of dumb shits, that also was big time pushed by Voltaire and the French philosophes. And all kinds of nonsense came out of this, claiming, for example, that Columbus didn't know the earth was round. The earth was known to be round. And by the way, I'm going to get into a lot of modern stuff too, but you have to have some of this historical background, I think, in order to understand the big picture of what's happening these days. Okay, so the world was known to be round by Aristotle, okay? That was known from the boats and the shipping and the shadows. Venerable Bede, 700 AD, Hildegard of Bingen, Thomas Aquinas, and all these other famous people, they all knew and everybody knew about it, that the earth was round. That's old news. But the big story that's not so well understood is what Voltaire and the atheist philosophers, how they tried to steal credit for science. And they were the ones that sort of tried to link the Middle Ages with the Dark Ages and primitive backwardness and stupidity, and claimed that their time, the philosophic group, was the true light of science, light as an enlightenment. The thing, though, was Newton, the greatest scientist who ever lived from the 1600s, he was like about the most devout guy who ever lived, too. And that's rather funny. He wrote as much about religion as anything else. Okay, and, the point I'm making is the philosophy of the philosophes, the French atheists of the 1700s, it led to the French Revolution, where 50,000 people were executed, 17,000 by the guillotine. And that's my point. I've seen this over and over. I've read tons of history, philosophy, science, and I have tons of experience as a physician and a scholar that atheist science leads to strategies on how to kill people, okay? It just leads to mass murder. And, sadly, the world is trending back down that path, and I hope it doesn't happen, but all I see is a lot of negative things. And so I'm going to help you to understand the philosophical, intellectual, and scientific background of some of this stuff so you can make wiser choices, and hopefully we'll all be better off. Christian theology was essential for the rise of science. The leading scientists of the 1500s and 1600s were overwhelmingly devout Christians who believed it their duty to comprehend God's handiwork. From Randy Stark, there's the book page number. Okay, now what about the Greeks? The Greeks did some good mathematical work for their time. Pythagoras, and his little magicians and whatnot, the Pythagorean theorem, early geometry, then Euclid, more advanced geometry, then Archimedes, the great engineer, give me a lever and I can move the world, eureka, I've got it. Okay, and now the pre-Socratics and Aristotle did some great speculation, but most of what they did was theoretical speculation. They really didn't do what we would consider modern science of, hypothesis, experiment, analysis of experiments, development of theories, and more experiments, okay? The Romans didn't have any great philosophers. Yeah, they had good builders, engineers, architects like Vitruvius, sure, but the Romans also had so many slaves. When you got tons of slaves to do everything, there's not a lot of incentive to try to make things more efficient, okay? Send the men off to work, steal the women. That's kind of the usual way slaves are handled, all right? In 732, Martel won a big victory over the Saracens, all right? He had advanced cavalry technology with armor, stirrups, a braced saddle, the Norman saddle, so they could ride with a lance. They had to brace their feet in the stirrups and have their backs braced by the Norman saddle in order to ram with the big lance. And that's how they conquered the Saracens at that time in 732. Europeans developed the horse collar so that the horse could pull a plow, and it was so much more efficient than the oxen, dramatically improving crop yields. Charlemagne and Alcuin promoted improved education. The Montessori's used to be called Alcuin Montessori's. Albertus Magnus and then Thomas Aquinas greatly developed the scholastic universities. The Catholics built the original universities. The Greeks didn't have big universities, or the Romans. They built up scholarship, and they laid the groundwork for more advanced science, like the astronomers that came along with Copernicus and whatnot. The original language back in those days was Latin for all the European scholars, so they could all talk to each other. They could travel between different lands and work with each other. It's kind of like what English is today. Now, they also developed the scholastics, the tradition of dissection for studying human anatomy, and the great founder of modern anatomy, father of modern anatomy, was Andreas Vesalius, who then took over at the University of Padua in the 1500s. Another really devout religious guy. Catholic. He died on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Okay, early astronomers and great scientists were very religious. The vast majority of them: Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Leibniz, Blaise Pascal, Andreas Vesalius, Robert Boyle. And yeah, I know the whole story of Galileo. I wrote papers about Galileo. We're not going to get into all that now, but Galileo was a religious guy. He was also a smart ass. He pissed off the Pope, and I think the Pope overreacted, and that's a whole big story. But that's like one guy, and it was largely for personal reasons. He's calling the Pope stupid, etc. Versus nowadays, any scientist or doctor who doesn't kiss ass to a pharmaceutical company, they will not get any more grants. They'll potentially be fired. A typical story is I have a friend who's a molecular biologist. This friend did research on high fructose corn syrup at the time where it was processed by pushed through a mercury battery was somehow part of the processing. There were some mercury residues in it. He published that, instantly fired. And tons of guys. Look at T. Colin Campbell. Talks about problems with protein. They tried to fire him, only he was protected by his tenure. There is intense censorship of people who tell the truth in science nowadays. It's an intense thing. Anybody mentions intelligent design in university today, fired. Look at the guy at the Smithsonian Institute who allowed an article to be published about intelligent design, fired. And that's happening all over the place, and it's really degrading modern science. Most people don't know anything about science. They just think, oh, everything is figured out, and scientists are smart, and they have no idea that most modern science is actually BS, and it's pushed by corporations to rip people off. Okay, so some of these great scientists, I think we just talked about them, including Blaise Pascal, Gottfried Leibniz, these other co-inventor of calculus. So these two mathematical geniuses. Look at all these mathematical geniuses there. Isaac Newton, Gottfried Leibniz, Blaise Pascal, some of the smartest mathematicians that ever lived. The smarter and more scientific people are, the more religious they tend to be are. The biological scientists and physicists are a lot more religious than somebody who barely can make it through the humanities, okay? Because they don't really understand. When you start seeing how incredible and complex all this stuff is, you're like, holy crap, only God could do something like this. Okay, so here's just a quote, typical quote from Johannes Kepler from the 1500s to 1630. God created us in his own image so that we could share in his thoughts. That type of philosophy of the world and worldview leads you to want to study science, okay? He's the one who figured out that planetary orbits were elliptical rather than circular, so you no longer needed the epicycles. Okay, now here's Newton, greatest scientist who ever lived, and the guy who really got science going in an incredible way. 1665 was the miracle year. of Isaac Newton. So let's just look at a typical quote of Newton, who Voltaire tried to claim him with his atheistic philosophy. Here's typical Newton, okay? He who thinks half-heartedly will not believe in God, but he who really thinks has to believe in God. I have a fundamental belief in the Bible as the Word of God. Written by those who were inspired, I study the Bible daily. All my discoveries have been made in answer to prayer. Atheism is so senseless. When I look at the solar system, I see the Earth at the right distance from the sun to receive the proper amounts of heat and light. This did not happen by chance. Isaac Newton. And by the way, there's a whole set, numerous arguments called the fine-tuning arguments of astronomy. And there's also related arguments for origin of life, origin of complexity, and for moments in the history of the development of life on this planet that have what are called fine-tuning arguments that cannot be explained by anything other than God, okay? And you'll see the fine-tuning arguments are a very interesting thing. And the astronomy arguments and whatnot, they have nothing to do with life on the planet. Well, they do in terms of making it possible for life on this planet, but anyway, that's a whole other subject. We won't get into that now. All right, now here's Rodney Stark from his book again, the FGG. Only in Europe did alchemy develop into chemistry, astrology, and into astronomy. It's not a matter of, now this is Stephen Meyer, author of Darwin's Doubt, a world-famous scholar. Okay, it's not a matter of debate that science as we know it today arose in Europe. Edward Grant, another one of these scholar guys who study all this stuff. It is indisputable that modern science emerged in Western Europe and nowhere else. Science in its modern form arose in Western civilization alone because only the Christian West possessed the necessary intellectual presuppositions. Ian Barber is another scholar, researcher of relationships between religion and science. And the point I'm saying is, if you believe that there's no such thing as God, like a lot of these godless religions do, and that there's no point in studying, you might as well just meditate and try to empty your mind. There's no incentive to develop a big scientific university system, research system. There's lots of smart people in every country, but at this time in the world, other countries did not have a worldview that energized them. And other problems, look at China. China was screwed. It's been screwed for a long time. In China, when somebody would start to develop a technology and make some money, the mandarins would just steal it from them. So your property was not secure. So somebody would say, well, why try to develop a profitable technology when it would just be stolen from you? Okay, and a lot of places, a lot in the East, everything was flat. And when you have a big flat land body, a tyrant can just conquer everybody, kick their asses, make them obey, and if they do anything original or non-conventional, just, take it away from them. So the point I'm saying is one of the reasons why Greek actually developed a lot of free thought and debate was because there was a bunch of rocky, mountainous places and islands where they could be safe from being conquered readily, and they could have their own opinions, and they interacted with a lot of other cultures to develop ideas and technologies and stuff. So there was, even though they didn't develop formal science, the Greeks did learn a lot of stuff and do a lot of stuff because they had that type of setup. They didn't really have the worldview, though, for modern science. Aristotle did the best he could, but even Aristotle, who was protected by Alexander the Great, when Alexander the Great died, the Athenians, came after Aristotle. He had to flee, and he died soon afterwards, okay? All right, the mandarins in China, they would grow their fingernails as long as they could to prove that they were above manual labor. Manual labor was something all the lowlifes did, not them, the leaders of China in the ancient days. And it was kind of funny. Bertrand Russell, who was a brilliant guy, but sort of a pompous jerk, he said, oh, well, I'm surprised science didn't develop in China because their atheism and godless religion traditions would prevent them from having obstacles to development of religion. But you don't get it. That's exactly why they didn't develop religion. They didn't have a worldview that inspired them to it. And that was the same in a lot of places. And if you have a bunch of slaves, again, you're not motivated to develop technology like in Europe, like in Russia in the 1800s or in the 1900s. Basically, commie peasants aren't much different than serfs. So, anyways, in ancient Egypt, a bunch of slavery, what are they going to do? All right, this is the last slide here. So, religion does not have much influence on modern science. Have you ever heard of modern religions trying to, successfully getting a scientist fired? I've never heard of it in the modern world. Okay. The whole story of Galileo is totally misrepresented and exaggerated. That's a topic for another day, though. Religion doesn't do jack in science, medicine, okay? it's these giant corporations and atheist organizations who try to distort science. They do it all the time. Literally, a rich corporation can buy the journals. They own many of the journals. And then only scientists or doctors who play ball with them and promote their product are allowed to be editors. So peer review is kind of a joke. You can't be a peer reviewer at that corporation's journal unless you promote that corporation's product. So that's totally biased so-called science. So that's why somebody says peer-reviewed literature, that really doesn't mean much to me. Take a look at all the great nutrition doctors. Every single one of them is outside the university system. Look at McDougall, he's out in private practice, and nobody would even send him a patient, okay? Look at Esselstyn at Cleveland Clinic. They didn't want him. They tried to get him out of there. He had to take legal pressure in order to be allowed to even have a little daytime clinic there for nutrition. T. Colin Campbell, they tried to fire him, and it goes on and on, okay? The truth about health and nutrition, it is not welcome in the modern university or the modern atheist organization, all right? And that's what happens. If you've got humans are created in the image of the God, therefore they're partly divine, therefore we should be kind to them and care for them and, try to help them. You're obligated to do certain things. You're obligated to tell the truth. I actually believe that stuff. That's why I'm trying to help all the proles, okay? But nobody ever listens to me. And what I'm trying to say is, if you get rid of all that stuff, why help the proles? Look at what Nietzsche said about Christianity. He said, Christianity is a religion of slaves, an inferior people. Why should superior people be influenced at all by this religion of slaves and pathetic inferiors, okay? And what I'm trying to say is, rich corporations aren't that different, okay? Their attitude is, why should we do anything that's going to decrease our profits? These are just consumers. We have no obligation to them. From a Darwinian point of view, they're just talking primates, okay? And a lot of harsher things have been said by other atheist organizations, like Germany in the 1930s, okay? Like Stalin's Russia. People are just, vermin. Anybody that they don't like is vermin, useless eaters, life not worth living, okay? And they really don't care what they do to you. And that's what happens. People get dehumanized once you get away from that creating the image of God worldview. Okay, look at the psychiatrists, all these pediatric psychiatrists, basically poisoning kids for attention deficit with stimulants and then the so-called, mood disorders, mood stabilizers. It's pretty easy. Anybody can look at the books and see this, but no one does anything about it. It's allowed to go on because the truth is no one really cares about all these poor kids. A wealthy, educated person, they'll read the books for themselves and they'll say, hey, these medications are BS. I'm not going to give this to my poor kid. Versus, average person's ignorant, doesn't know anything, and their kids get put on all these toxic things that cause brain damage over time. And then also you ask yourself, why is it that 99% of medical doctors, they don't even know that a high-fat diet causes hypertension and diabetes. They don't know anything about rural Kenya, Yanomamo, Tarahumara, or the relationship of sodium to hypertension other than some ignorant stuff. I know, because I talk to doctors all the time. They're totally ignorant of these things. Totally. And even, I'm talking about the smarter ones. Even the AOAs, the top 10% of the class. I know them, okay? Even a lot of the 99%. There's a lot of smart people that I know, okay? And they don't know any of this stuff. And so what I'm trying to say, they've been trained by a system where there's no value in seeking this knowledge. No one even keeps track of results for almost everything. So basically, look, you sell somebody a drug, you make money. You teach them how to educate themselves and improve their health, you don't make any money. So why do it, okay? The only reason to do it is because you care about them and you care about good results, okay? It'd be good if they actually published physicians' outcomes, for diabetes, for hypertension or something, because then there'd be pressure to get better results. Currently, no. You follow the guidelines, you make your money, you go home. And you can talk about very low-fat diet, and it's also because of the patients. They're so lazy and uncurious that even if you tell them how to improve their health, they don't want to do it. I'm always amazed by that. Every day in every single hospital in any, civilized, advanced technological country, you'll see lines of people waiting for all this high-tech stuff. Blood tests, CAT scans, ultrasounds, going for surgery, all this fancy stuff. But then you tell one of them, you really need to eat a very low-fat, plant-based diet with no meat, not one bite, no oil, not one drop, no sweets, no caffeine, no coffee, no tea. They go, get out of here. The patients get pissed off. And so the only thing that would really save them, they don't want it. But they'll let you chop them up with surgery. They'll let you drug the crap out of them with 10, 15, 20, 30 meds. Ask any practicing physician. It's pretty routine to see patients on 20, 30 medications. It's crazy, okay? All right. I take zero medicines, okay? I'm just about 59 years of age. I take zero meds. I don't need any medication. Come on. Healthy people don't need medications. All right. When I was in my residency, one of the attending doctors said, the CAT scanner is a machine to print money. These CAT scanners, they run nonstop all day long. Tons of patients. Patients think, oh, it's almost like, I heard one attending say, it's like an American's birthright to get a CAT scan, okay? People think, oh, I got to go for my CAT scan, blah, blah, blah. If you want to fix the basic issues, you got to improve blood supply to all your organ systems and stop poisoning yourself with toxins and estrogenics. All right, so anyways, Darwinism has been taken on by atheism and atheist corporations as a way to try to claim that they have their own creation story that's scientific. And basically, whether or not you're going to have a free society and healthy people is going to depend on this stuff. If you don't realize that, you haven't studied it yet. And that's why it kind of really does matter. And it doesn't matter what an individual does. What any individual does is their own personal business. But the mentality of a society, whether or not they believe in the rights of an individual, the significance of the individual, that they truly deserve to be told the truth and honestly dealt with, even if it's not profitable, even if it's not fast and convenient and expedient, that will determine the overall situation in society. And I see a progressive deterioration of society and science in my own lifetime. And it's really sad and it's really bad, but most people are sort of blissfully ignorant about it. But it's becoming more difficult to be blissfully ignorant of all these things. Okay, Christianity says humans are created in the image of God and thus partly divine, entitled to rights, equal before God. A Christian worldview provided inspiration. And don't get me wrong, I think there's tons of stupidities and problems with Christianity. All of that I get. But I also get that it does produce a worldview that values the individual, including the poor people, the mentally retarded, all these people. They are equal in the eyes of God, and that leads to an obligation to be honest and nice to them and tell them the truth and try to help them. So here's Rodney Stark continuing. Christianity depicted God as rational, responsive, dependable being who is a responsible, rational being, and the universe as his personal creation, thus having a rational, stable structure, the universe, and it was awaiting human comprehension. And science arose in Europe because of so that's Rodney Stark, the author of this book. And then the other guy who was big on this is Alfred North Whitehead. He was partners with Bertrand Russell around 1900, and the significance is he had a breakaway from Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell promoted this atheistic view of the world, even though he did respect and recognize a lot of the benefits of Christianity. Whitehead sort of contradicted him, and he said, look, science arose in Europe because of the widespread faith in the possibility of science. Derivative from medieval theology, the belief that every detailed occurrence can be correlated with its prior antecedents in a definitive manner because God was rational. That's sort of the big point. Because God was rational, we have a rational universe, and we are created in his image. Therefore, we can be creators. Therefore, we can understand his creation. He wants us to. That's why he made us like him in some ways. So all of that leads to this energization of the population to try to learn science, or at least of the scientists, okay? And when you believe that man is created in the image of God, you care about people and you respect them. You're obligated to. And you don't poison them, you don't rip them off, all right? When there is no God, there's just competing groups, and each competing group tries to make more money for themselves, and so what if they abuse, rip off the other group, which they label as inferior and dehumanize? So anyways, just showing the historical background on this. I hope that was useful to you.